Can I invite Benedikt and Hugh to come here and join me in the panel? So welcome back to this high-level dialogue on various aspects of the Arctic and the Third Pole cooperation. Before we introduce the speech by His Excellency Dr. Thani, the Minister for Foreign Trade of the UAE, who also had to go to Davos, I tried to tell the leadership of this country that the Third Pole dialogue is way more important than the economic dialogue in the World Economic Forum. But before we start, I just want to mention the tragic passing of our friend Scott Miner, the Chief Investment Officer of Guggenheim Partners, who had been a part of the Arctic Circle community and founding partner from the very beginning, and was, with all due respect to my two friends who are here on the stage, perhaps the leader on this effort of Arctic Investment Partnership. And at the Arctic Circle Assembly in October, he was in full force introducing these ideas and plans, and had already decided in December, early December, to be with us here in Abu Dhabi. And then suddenly one afternoon he died, 63 years old. A great loss, not only to his friends and family and the American financial community. He was one of the great respected intellectual leaders of the American financial market, as can be seen by his many appearances on Bloomberg and Reuters and CNBC and other media, as well as Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. But he was also a great visionary on the Arctic and led the effort within the Arctic Circle and the World Economic Forum 10 years ago or so, to create what was later known as the Arctic Investment Protocol, which was formally launched at the World Economic Forum in Davos, I think 7 or 8 years ago, which is a guiding document of sustainable investment in the Arctic. Could also be useful to the Third Pole area. It was an effort to bring together leading forces in the business community and the sustainable climate and environmental activists in the world to create a guideline for sustainable investment in the Arctic. And then following that, he instigated a listing of Arctic investment opportunities, which was formally announced at the Arctic Circle Assembly and then delivered to the Wilson Center in Washington, where this extraordinary document is available, I think, online. And the conclusion was the opportunity for over $1 trillion US dollars opportunity in Arctic investment. So a few weeks before COVID started, Scott Miner and I met in New York and then in Colorado to outline an effort which we called the Arctic Investment Partnership. The idea was to bring together various financial entities, state, sovereign funds, private investors, banks, and others, in a large-scale effort for Arctic investment. And this was introduced at the last two Arctic Circle assemblies. And a year ago, I had a discussion here in Abu Dhabi with His Excellency Dr. Thani, now Minister for Foreign Trade, previously Minister for Climate. And he expressed a great interest for the UAE to participate in this effort. And yesterday we had another meeting with him, where we presented him with a memorandum outlining some of the structures, and he decided to mandate one of his key advisors to continue the dialogue with us. But in addition to Guggenheim Partners, the Arion Bank in Iceland, represented here by the CEO, and the investment fund from Alaska, PT Capital, led also by the CEO here, Hugh, have been, together with Guggenheim, instrumental partners in this trilateral effort within the Arctic Circle framework in the last year or two. And although we miss dearly our good friend Scott Miner from this panel, and will continue to miss him in the years and decades to come, we decided to continue with this dialogue in any case, and open it with this speech by His Excellency, Dr. Thani, where, as you will hear, he tries to relate this dialogue on Arctic Investment Partnership to the third pole area. And I find it very interesting that this leading minister responsible for foreign trade from the United Arab Emirates, looking at his neighbors, Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, China, is already contemplating the economic opportunities for the Himalayan region in the light of this exploratory discussion within the Arctic Partnership. So when I open the floor for questions after initial comments from the panelists here after the speech, please don't hesitate to relate your questions to the Himalayan Third Pole area on the basis of what's outlined here. And with those introductory words, I will ask for the speech to be played, and then I will ask first Benedikt and then Hugh to make a comment.
It's my pleasure to address you all today at the Arctic Circle Abu Dhabi Forum. As you all know, it's part of a larger partnership between the Arctic Circle and the UAE to support awareness of the Arctic model in the Himalayan region. The Himalayas are at the heart of Asia's climate change challenge. The highest mountain range in the world is now facing the threat of melting glaciers and water insecurity. As we build toward COP28 this year, the UAE is eager to support any efforts that promote research and knowledge sharing around these important issues. The good news is that we have an established collaboration model to rely on. The Arctic states have been widely recognized for their success in balancing economic growth with environmental action. Their science-based approach to collaborative, constructive policymaking has now become a global benchmark. Our work with the Himalayan region draws inspirations from their efforts, and it's clear we need stronger, mutually beneficial partnerships among all Asian nations, not just those with a direct connection to the range. This approach aligned with the UAE's economic vision for the next 50 years. We remain keen to boost our trade and investment exchange and promote knowledge sharing with this increasingly important region. Our relations are already strong. In the first 9 months of 2022, the UAE's trade with the 5 Himalayan nations of India, China, Pakistan, Bhutan, and Nepal amounted to about $96 billion, growth of 21% compared to the same period of 2021, and representing 22% of the UAE's entire non-oil trade. These figures underline the economic importance of this region to the UAE and why we are particularly keen to mitigate the potential devastating impact of climate change on its people and environment. Ladies and gentlemen, the UAE is currently laying the foundation for our future by building a sustainable, diverse economy that attracts talent and nurtures entrepreneurs and innovation. Most notably, we have adopted a number of bold reforms that have significantly enhanced our economy's openness to the world and created a business-friendly legislative and regulatory frameworks. This includes revamping our visa and residency systems, developing clear strategies to attract FDI and international talents, enhancing the country's export and empowering SMEs. We have launched initiatives to promote entrepreneurships and startup growth, including the Entrepreneurial Nation and the new Next Gen FDI program, which is attracting some of the world's most dynamic companies to the UAE. Our comprehensive economic partnership agreements are also accelerating trade, securing supply chains, and creating new opportunities for investment and collaboration. Our first CEPA was with India, one of the region's key nations and now the 5th largest economy on the planet. Through these measures, we are positioning the private sector as the main engine of the UAE's economic development. As a result of these combined efforts, the UAE's non-oil trade achieved a breakthrough during the first half of 2022, exceeding 1 trillion dirhams in the period of just 6 months. Ladies and gentlemen, this aggressive economic transformation is generating countless opportunities in our market. By capitalizing on them, the UAE is keen to advance our trade and economic ties with the countries of the Himalayas. In addition to contributing to the sustainable development and resilience of our economies, intensified trade and investment exchanges and continued dialogue are also key to offsetting and adapting to the effects of climate change. Therefore, I'm looking forward to the contribution of this forum to the achievements of this goal, and I wish you all very productive participation. Thank you.
Well, and with these words, I will give Benedikt Gíslason the floor to make his introductory remarks, and then follow that by Hugh short. Benedikt.
Thank you so much. I would like to start by going through a few slides where we outline the opportunities in the Arctic from an investment standpoint. And now to begin with, the countries around the Arctic Circle share similar characteristics. There are plentiful resources in the area. Those are mainly rural communities, share the same climate, and culture and educationally there are ties between these countries. What is also interesting about this area, even though there are around only 0.1% of the world's population living in the area, the region makes a significant contribution to the world. What is also, I think, important to highlight here is that this resource-driven economy has, or economies have all been developed in a sustainable manner. If you look at the fisheries in the North Atlantic Ocean, which is around 12% of fish caught in the world, they are driven by a sustainable fisheries quota system. The same applies to the 11% in the waters around Alaska. So in total, the area produces some 23% of wild fish. Salmon fish farming as well, where the Norwegians have effectively taken a leading position and have then made investments into areas like Iceland, Scotland, Faroe Islands, and if you look at the energy source, that has been harnessed in a sustainable way, and it's hydro, geothermal, and wind, obviously, and in Alaska you have other energy sources as well, but very much done in a sustainable way. And I think this, in fact, benefits this area or region when it comes to tourist destination. So there is an emerging trend in the tourist industry, which is sometimes referred to as ecotourism, and we've seen quite an impact of that in recent months and years. And then finally, maybe before I leave this slide, I think it's worth mentioning that rare earth minerals have now been identified in Greenland, and I was in the Arctic Circle Forum in Nuuk last year, where I listened to the finance minister of Greenland saying that Greenland is probably the most exposed country in the world when it comes to global warming, with the glaciers melting. But at the same time, they are probably in a position to contribute more to the solution of this issue by mining the green minerals that are needed for the energy transition. If you look at the Arctic and maybe Iceland, because I come from there in particular, and it's a great kind of connection hub as well, especially when it comes to the transatlantic flight routes, and even if you look at the pan-Arctic shipping routes as well. But here we have figures that summarize the ecotourism development in the region. And you can see that Iceland has grown into a very popular tourist destination with 4.5 times its population visiting every year. Faroe Islands is at 3, Greenland at 2 times, and it's probably going to evolve closer to Iceland. And this, the similar figure for Alaska is actually 3.2 times. So Alaska is at the top of the league here. I think I've touched on most of the opportunities here, but I would want to highlight, because I talked about salmon fish farming, a recent development in Iceland is to harness the geothermal energy in a more sustainable way by bringing fish farming on land. And there are currently 3 mega projects being explored in Iceland, which probably rank top 5 in the world, and will be interesting to follow. I think each of them represents an investment of some 500 million euros, and are, as such, very large scale. Now, there is an emerging thing also here, which will change the region and make it even more kind of strategic when it comes to resource extraction, shipping, fishing, and tourism, and that is the opening of new Arctic shipping lanes. And we've already seen some impact of that, and I'm sure that in coming years and decades, these considerably shorter transit routes will make this region even more important when it comes to trade and resource extraction, as I said. And finally, before I hand over to my colleague Hugh Short, I just want to highlight that Iceland is a strategic hub in this area, and has a kind of as an EEA member and with a financial system that operates under the EU directive, a robust and strong infrastructure to service the region when it comes to finance. And Mr. Grímsson mentioned the work that Guggenheim did, and just to reflect on the infrastructure projects, which are estimated to be around 8,300 and more than $300 billion out of the 3 trillion investments that are likely to take place in the region in the coming decades. So these are substantial investments that will be required. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Hugh.
How many people are from the Arctic in this audience? I'm just curious. Hands, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. How many have been to the Arctic? Maybe double that. Well, you should come visit us. My name's Hugh Short. I'm with PT Capital. Where did you go?
I didn't go anywhere, but I have been studying Arctic for many years now.
Oh, okay. All right. Where do you want to go? What's your favorite place? You can say Alaska. All right. Perfect. My name's Hugh Short. I'm with PT Capital. Before I start, President Grímsson mentioned Scott Minerd. I first met Scott in 2011. I was working for an indigenous Alaska Native corporation, Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, and Scott showed up at a conference in Girdwood, Alaska, and he started discussing investment in the Arctic. I very quickly was impressed to be in the room with him, and it imprinted me to where 2 years later PT Capital was founded, based off of Scott's being a role model. At the last Arctic Circle Assembly in October, I recall being on a panel with Scott. He was sitting next to me. I was sitting here. I think maybe Benny was on the panel, and I recall maybe talking about doing a listing. We did an IPO of a company called Nova, and Scott piped in and said, hold on a second, Guggenheim's the largest investor in PT Capital, so if it wasn't for me, that listing would have never happened. So I'll always have that memory of that. The discussion today really is about Arctic investing. And if I could just sort of reflect on my lifetime of experience, there's some common traits between folks in the Arctic. Those of you from the Arctic, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Those of you not from the Arctic, I'm never wrong. So the first is, and this is from being from Alaska, going to Iceland, going to many places in Canada, people are very similar in their cultural pride. So if you look at the connection of the Icelanders to their cultural pride of 1,000 years on that island, it's substantial. The same for my heritage, which is in Inupiaq from northern Alaska. There's a language pride. So if you go to each and every one of these locations, there's a unique dialect or a unique language, and that language is very strong. There's a connection to the land, a very strong connection to the land, and a connection to the animals. And you know, they say a vegetarian Eskimo doesn't exist because they die, because you have to eat what's off the land. There is a respect, a very firm respect for the climate and the harshness of the climate, and understanding that. If you look at the economies of the Arctic, Benny hit on this, but really it's tourism, resources, energy. There's a large logistics component of this part of the world. And if you go to every part of Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Alaska, the Nordics, those are very similar traits. Coming from Alaska, there is a general distrust of outsiders, outside investors, outsiders, period. There's a long history of colonialism, long history of outsiders controlling locations in the Arctic. So you will find a general distrust of outsiders in this part of the world. And the need for capital is not unique in every part of this. Iceland, for instance, has a very advanced financial services system. Coming from Alaska, we're in the United States, you would think we would be as advanced. But Alaska, and I keep inviting Benny to invest into Alaska, because the financial services system could be, that they've developed, could greatly enhance the economy in Alaska. There's talent that exists, and I think on this point, in 2022, we started investing in 2017 in Iceland. In 2022, probably my most prideful moment was in a very respected Icelandic company investing into Alaska and being a partner with us. And so that's really the sharing of talent between the two locations. And then finally, this slide up here, people ask, what is the Arctic Investment Partners? And there's a lot of lines, arrows, dots, and stuff on this. But I think very simply, if you look at this, tech and telecom, agriculture, which could be land-based fishing and fisheries, transportation, energy, tourism, they're all needs in the Arctic. If you're in Greenland, if you're in northern Canada, if you're in northern Alaska or southern Alaska, if you're in Iceland, these are very strong needs for investment. And in many cases, the investment dollars are very hard to get, very hard to attract. And so what we envision is Arctic stakeholders and folks like the Sovereign Wealth Fund from UAE and others to participate and join us in an effort to create a pool of capital that could then be allocated towards the greatest needs and projects that will create jobs, will create economies, and make each of those communities healthier. Our strategy is really around what we announced in October, was we would be forming a working group. I've received a lot of folks who are interested in participating. If there's any within this group, we can do a breakout today or tomorrow and just sort of invite you into the process. With Scott's passing, we've hit a little bit of a pause out of respect for the process. But that being said, Mr. Lena, who's sitting right there, raise your hand. He is in charge of making sure that if there's anyone in this room interested in plugging into this process, that we get your name, your email, where you're from, and how to get you involved. At the end of the day, our goal is to make an announcement this year that the fund's formed. President Grímsson has been very, very working very hard on our behalf to put this together. It is, I think, essential that we look at the best operating companies, whether you're in the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, the best investors, who can we invest alongside of, the best projects, and really focus on being able to deploy the capital in a way that provides return for RLPs, but then also is invested in a way that's respectful to the environment, respectful to the social governance of that community, and respectful to the overall goal of going carbon neutral. We think that it's critically important in these communities that are most affected by climate change, that the projects we invest into will ultimately focus on trying to get those communities towards net neutral. That being said, we live in some of the most isolated places in the world, so that journey is going to take some time. I think with that, I'll just pause and hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And before I open the floor for questions, I will just put one question to both of you. But before, I just want to mention that when I started my friendship and partnership with Scott Miner almost 10 years ago, he was still in the position of being a major player on the American capital market. And all his colleagues were asking him, Scott, why are you wasting your time thinking about and being engaged in the Arctic? And Scott said, that's the future, guys. That's the future, guys. And when Trump did this famous tweet about buying Greenland, all the American media and the financial market woke up to the fact that what is it about Greenland that makes Trump tweet that he wants to buy it if it was for sale, which the government of Greenland made clear within a few hours from that tweet. So it is only within a decade that we have seen the transformation of the interest and the focus on the Arctic from an investment economic point of view, from being a completely a niche, almost nerdish kind of engagement, to moving mainstream in the geopolitical scene. So my question to you, the two of you, is where do you think we will be 10 years from now? Where do you think you will be 10 years from now? And before you answer, I want to draw your attention, the audience, to the fact that 5 years ago, there was no five-star hotel in my country. There is still no five-star hotel in Greenland. And with all due respect to Alaska and to the best of my knowledge, there's not a five-star hotel in Alaska, although a few think they are a five-star hotel. But a few weeks ago, one of the preeminent investment funds here in Abu Dhabi, ADQ, bought a big part of shares in the Edition Hotel next to Harpa in Reykjavik, the preeminent five-star hotel in my country. If anybody had told me when I first talked to Scott 10 years ago that the UAE investment fund owned by the royal family here would buy my majority share in a five-star hotel in Iceland, I would simply have laughed and say, come on, that's not going to happen. So I think it's very interesting for us from the Arctic, because money talks, money talks. So this country which is hosting us now has already taken a bet on the future of the Arctic tourism. And although the Himalayan third pole countries are different in terms of accessing, I think it's only a time until the millions, hundreds of millions of young people especially, in the mega cities of Asia, Africa, Europe, and Americas, want to flock to the Himalayas to experience the majestic nature of the mountains and the communities and the culture. Like what's happening in the Arctic. When we built the Keflavik airport terminal, and I was on the committee, it was built on the assumption that there would be maximum 300,000 tourists to Iceland every year. When I said 10 years ago in a conference by Icelandair that we need to prepare ourselves for it being 2 million by the end of this decade, now, everybody laughed at the coffee break at the silliness in the president. This year it will be 2.7 million tourists. There will be 1,000 cruise ships coming to Iceland this year. 20 years ago, zero. So we are seeing an extraordinary transformation where the deserted, mountainous, majestic part of the world, the Arctic and the Himalayas and the Third Pole, will sooner than we think attract millions and dozens of millions and hundreds of millions of especially young, educated people who want to experience this wilderness and see the glaciers melting and observe the nature and the culture. So I think we need to be aware that like the ADQ fund here in the OE, to everybody's surprise in Iceland, bought out the Icelandic owners of the five-star hotels. We better catch up, that's my message. We better catch up in terms of the Himalayas, the Third Pole, and the Arctic economies, because the world is already interested in our part of the world. So, back to my question, where will we be in 10 years' time?
We will be a sought-after place to visit to begin with. I think our kind of services to the tourist industry would have evolved further. And as I mentioned, for example, Greenland, I think, has immense opportunities to welcome visitors around its vast land and territory. And I think the region will be a sought-after place to invest into because of the sustainable investment opportunities that are to be found there. And economically, would have progressed.
I'll make 3 predictions. One is, I think the hardest part about Arctic logistics is flights go south and then they go north and then so getting from, let's say, Alaska to Anchorage to Nuuk, it'll take you 30 hours. If you had a private jet or a jet that was willing to drop you off along the way, it would be a 6-hour flight. And so the ability for Arctic residents to culturally, educationally, economically get to know each other better is hindered by the lack of east-west. And I'd say in 10 years, maybe Icelandair, maybe some other airlines figure that out. I think the second thing is you're going to see companies, large companies created that are owned across the Arctic. Right now you have silos, which generally go Alaska to the lower 48 or America, and they're owned in that way from Canada, northern Canada down to southern Canada, Greenland to Denmark in many instances. And so I think what you're going to see is a east-west model of corporations then sharing knowledge. I think my third prediction is, it's an unfortunate reality of growing up in Alaska and the Arctic, is we've got some of the highest suicide rates in the world. And a lot of that is because culturally we went from 100 or 200 years ago to today, and there's a lack of jobs, education, and resources for the youth. In 10 years, my hope would be that because of all the economic development, the focus on jobs, the ability for people to now travel to the Arctic, that we will see a lot more healthier communities in the north.
Great. Okay, so let's have some questions from the floor. Well, there was much more livelier question. Russ. Maybe we get some third pole Himalayan perspective of this economic discussion later on. Yeah, right.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Rasmus Bertelsen from the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø and University of Akureyri. Especially Benedikt, the economic overview you gave of Iceland, of the Arctic, I don't think it took into account the deglobalization and decoupling we are seeing in the world economy. Just 5-10 years ago, I think we were heading into a much more globalized, integrated world, which I also think we see around us here. But I quite frankly think that many people in the West are very keen to shut themselves off from the rest of the world. And also now you mentioned that the Arctic economies are mainly natural resource-based economies. So I guess I have two questions about Arctic economy, and Hugh, you're also very welcome to respond. The first is, what does this decoupling, deglobalization mean for Arctic economies? And the second is that, of course, we see enormous disruption to the global energy market from the war in Ukraine, that Russia is one of the world's 3 largest oil and gas producers, very much the Russian Arctic. So these enormous disruptions to the global energy market, how do they affect the Arctic? That's perhaps more Alaska question. And then actually, if I may put a third pole question, which perhaps some of our colleagues from the third pole would like to reflect on, the intervention from the minister who talked about investments, but I'm thinking about the human connections between the Gulf and the third pole. I mean, there's so many people from South Asia, from Himalayan countries. I think I have driven with 2 Nepali drivers during my visit here. So what do the human connections between the third pole states and the Gulf states mean for these questions? Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think I remember most of your questions, and I would like to start with maybe answering your energy point here, given the fact that I'm quite familiar with the discussion in Iceland about the opportunity of setting up the Icelink interconnector to Europe, to the UK, and connect our energy kind of supply and contribute to that. And I think in recent months there has been more discussion in Iceland about Iceland's contribution as a founding NATO member to the NATO alliance, and whether we should contribute to the energy security of the NATO alliance. And it's been a very difficult discussion locally, and there is no political leadership around it. But I think Mr. Grímsson has highlighted the fact that maybe the unlocking this situation would be to harness some of the massive hydro potential that is to be found in Greenland, and lay a slightly longer cable from Greenland through Iceland, through Faroe Islands, and to Scotland. This is, I would say, probably a discussion for the next few years, and a project that will probably take more than 10 years to develop. And you can, this kind of increased geopolitical intensity, you can sense somewhat in Iceland and probably more in Greenland. We're aware of the fact that one of the largest investment that the US military is making this year outside of North America is actually in the Keflavík airport, where they're building, I think, facility or expanding the facility there. And when it comes to the mining licenses in Greenland, there have been certain sensitivities around some of those, obviously also related to uranium exploration. But what I can sense when these countries are cooperating, and we can hear that from advisory firms that have operated in the region, that there is very much a focus on best practice when it comes to kind of resource exploration and licenses. And I know for a fact that McKinsey is setting up an office in Iceland to focus specifically on that, to make sure that this is done in a best practice way for the benefit of the nations. And I think that kind of collaboration is helping these economies to manage the resources in a prudent way. And I think Iceland, you can look at Iceland as an example of a very good progress, being kind of resource rich, but having been able to develop its sort of knowledge-based industries on the back of that, with kind of strong institutions and universities. And I think other countries around us look on Iceland as an example of that.
Before I give the floor to Hugh, and then we will have a response here, and then we will come to you. I take issue a bit with your statement of decoupling from the globalization. I don't think that is in fact the case, at least as far as Iceland is concerned, or even what the Arctic is concerned. And just let us look at the hotel business in Iceland. I just mentioned that the investment fund here, ADQ, has bought the majority, I think it's a majority share, in this world-class five-star hotel in Iceland edition. A hotel chain in Malaysia, Beraya, just before COVID, bought the Icelandair hotel chain. All the hotels. They are now owned by Malaysia. And they just announced a few weeks ago that they have a plan to build another five-star hotel in Iceland. So in a few years' time, the two five-star hotels in Iceland will on the one hand be owned by the UAE, or the Arabs, as we say in Iceland, and the other will be owned by Malaysia. Is that a decoupling from the globalization? No, it's not. And then Hugh from Alaska owns the other hotel chain in Iceland. So basically, the major players in the hotel business in Iceland, and don't forget 1/3 of our foreign currency comes from the tourism. The fisheries, the aluminum smelter, and the tourism are the big foreign currency, three big foreign currencies. They are now owned by Arabs, Malaysia, and also Alaska. So the fact is that globalization has taken over the hotel business in Iceland, by and large. So I think one can't really conclude that this small Arctic country, Iceland, with just over 300,000, is somehow decoupled from the world, the globalization. In fact, it's hitting us hard. So, Hugh, you are the primary demonstration that globalization is happening to Iceland. Yes. Yep.
You know, I think you look at the world 10 years ago when we first started investing into Iceland and other parts of the Arctic, and I think the world today is three buckets. You got aggressors, and you could throw, to a certain extent, Russia, China, and other countries in there that are aggressive to the West, or hard calcified borders have been created. You've got the neutral countries. UAE would fall into that bucket, where they essentially get along with our aggressors and invest with us. And then you've got the West, and the West has been fortified by the latest aggression. You look at NATO. NATO was essentially an NGO 10 years ago. It wasn't well funded, wasn't well run. Today, the United States, as mentioned, is making its largest military investment in Iceland. And so you look at Thule in Greenland, additional huge investment by the U.S. military. You look at what's happening in Europe with regard to military buildup. And then economically, 5 years ago, Americans were 40% of our hotel guests, 35, 40%. This year, they were 65, 70%. So I have a theory that now you have aggressors, you got neutrality, and you got the West. The West will work closer together. Obviously, the Russian Arctic is in a space that we invest into. And so I think that there's going to be more collaboration in a smaller pool with very clear enemies, very clear frenemies, and very clear allies. And I think that's where we're headed.
Okay, so can you bring the microphone here?
Thank you very much. Learning from Arctic by the third pole Himalaya region. All the areas which you mentioned in terms of investment is based in Arctic region on the natural resources or resources right in the Arctic. That's very, very well said, and it's very important if we look into the sustainability part in the long run. Looking into the investments there, the third pole Himalaya region also has similar resource potential. Some of the issues that I would like to throw here and learn from your experience how we can address, picking 3 examples. One is energy, another one is agriculture, which you say. I'll bring the tea industry from our side, which is a high value product, globally recognized, number 2. And the number 3 is tourism. So investment in tea agriculture has been quite significant from outside also, mostly from outside, but much of the earnings goes outside. So the people in the mountains, they remain more like laborers rather than the owners. There are some examples where in Nepal, eastern Nepal, now the farmers are owning the tea garden or small gardens, and they sell the tea leaves, then that becomes a different perspective. But British's style of tea garden in some of these areas have been more taking the resources out but giving nothing back. So this is one thing which we need to look into. The other second one is energy. So hydro energy in the context of global climate change is a safer energy. We all realize that. 500 gigawatt potential from the third pole region. You can imagine how much it is. But the problem is for construction, infrastructure for hydro project in such a fragile environment, high mountain areas are environmental risky. Is there a possibility from Arctic to bring good technologies in these areas where we would be able to really learn from Arctic, and some of the investors from Arctic or from other parts of the world would like to see that and invest in this region, number 2. Number 3, tourism, of course. See, our countries, both China and India, they have huge domestic market, domestic tourism. So here, rather than quality, I think tourism again is crossing the carrying capacity limit, and the quality waste, large waste management issues. We know the issues very much, but to really learn how the institutional mechanism can be developed in tourism sector is something which would be very, very much required for the third pole region. So investments, high potential, 500 gigawatt. Tourism, we are talking about 4 million people. Mobilizing domestically, forget about the international outside. It's lots of people. And now the people are able to move. You see how much Chinese are moving, how much Indians are moving around, how much Pakistanis, all Bangladesh, everybody is moving around, even from Nepal you can see. So it's a huge potential there. So really, I mean, we need to really have good mechanisms and institutions. So some of the things from Arctic, because you have been there investing, thinking for 8 countries and the region, how we could also think similarly from ICIMOD point of view in terms of investment. This is what I feel. Otherwise, there is lots of similarities.
Well, thank you very much for that. Our time is out. So, but I will take, if you can put your question in less than a minute, both of you together, you have 30 seconds each. And then we will take quick responses here.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask you the question very quickly. That we have been talking about this disaster situation that could be because of the melting of Himalayas as well as the Arctic, because not only it's causing water security problem, but also flooding. And we did not touch about the reflective cover that is we are getting today because of the ice that is there. When it is not there, it can have that feedback loop that could exacerbate your global warming. So my fundamental question, to that investment, well, investment is good for the economic purposes, but the question I'm tagging on to previous commenter, that whether investment to extract resources from such areas or increase ecotourism is fundamentally sustainable for this region, whether are we damaging or worsening the situation? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, he already used up 1 minute, so you have to be very quick.
Hello, okay. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I have two quick questions. One is, you said that you do investment in the Russian Arctic. My obvious curiosity is that that's a very fragile area, climate-wise, environmental-wise, and even the geophysically. So what kind of investment?
I invest? I said I don't invest.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
Don't.
So then that's safe, because
Okay,
I was worried that it's going to be dangerous. Okay, thank you. The other question was, we often face this issue when we are presenting our climate restoration modeling impact work, particularly with the Alaskan indigenous community. How likely are they willing to adapt or, accept mitigation technologies implementations? Are they willing to accept how things can change? Because we get a lot of pushback when we present our work, sometimes.
Okay, quick answers. Hugh.
So between all of that, quick answers. Alaska Native people are not homogenous. They're not, everyone thinks this. All right, that's my first point. My second point is that Alaska Natives have lived there for 10,000, 12,000 years. They own the land, they own the resources. They actually make their own decisions with their own governance and their own board of directors. It is not upon myself to criticize another indigenous group, and I would say it's not upon you to tell an indigenous group how they should make decisions. They've got schools, clinics, society that they have to manage and they have to provide. So to tell one person that, hey, you don't get a school for your children, or you don't get a hospital for your residents, and you keep those resources in the ground, and you should sacrifice for the rest of the 7 billion people in the world. I think that that's a ridiculous position to come from, and I believe that it is unfair for other people in the world to take someone's land, resources, and their own governance, and their own people, and try and overlay some other, value that maybe they feel. So to me, I think that that's it's a critically important position to push up against.
Benedikt, you have the final word.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that what I mentioned in my opening presentation, that the investments that have been made in this area for the past few decades have been very much done with a sustainability kind of approach, and that's been because it's been good business. If you look at Iceland, how we converted from oil heating into geothermal, that was good business because oil price shoot up in the 80s. Our fisheries, we put in a quota system because we were doing unsustainable fisheries in Iceland. And apart from Alaska, Norway, and Russia, this area is not about oil and gas. It's about hydro energy, geothermal, and it's about sustainable fisheries, and it's about minerals that are required for the energy transition. And I think it's wise to explore those, because that will quicken or make it easier to move into green energy sources.
Thank you, both of you. And that unfortunately has to be the end of this session. We have overrun our time considerably. If I remember correctly, we will go into a session on the lessons from the Arctic, no.
Himalaya.
Okay, they know better than I. Anyhow, it will come on the screen, but later on we will talk about the lessons from the Arctic Council as well as other Arctic entities. But hopefully we will be able to report at the Arctic Circle Assembly in October progress on the Arctic Investment Partnership. Maybe that could be one of the models that the Third Pole Himalayan countries could use as a laboratory or as a toolbook or toolkit as you move forward in the coming years. So thank you very much.